She said it while I was still holding my coat. Didn't wait for me to sit down. Didn't lower her voice. Vanessa looked at me across the reception desk of the clinic I had funded from the ground up. The floors I had chosen, the equipment I had signed for, the walls that existed because I had written the check. And she said, "We've restructured. Your involvement is no longer necessary. You're replaceable." My son was standing 6 feet behind her. He said nothing. I smiled. She had no idea what I had kept. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. Let me take you back to before the clinic had a name. Before it had walls or a sign or a waiting room with chairs I had selected from a catalog while sitting at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with a cup of tea gone cold beside me. Before any of it existed, there was just my son Daniel, 29 years old, sitting across from me at that same kitchen table with a folder of printed pages and a look on his face that I had not seen since he was 8 years old and had decided he wanted to be the kind of person who built things. He had that look, the one that lives somewhere between a dream and a demand, and he slid the folder across the table and said, "Mom, I need you to read this." I read it. It was a business plan for a private physiotherapy and rehabilitation clinic. Detailed, ambitious, formatted with the kind of care that told me he had been working on it for months without telling me. Location analysis, projected patient volumes, equipment lists, staffing models, 5-year revenue projections. It was good work. Not perfect. There were assumptions in the revenue model that were optimistic in the way that first business plans always are, built on best-case scenarios by someone who has not yet learned that reality negotiates. But the bones of it were solid and the vision behind it was real. I closed the folder. I looked at my son, and I said, "How much do you need?" He said, "Everything I've listed comes to about $280,000, but with a proper contingency buffer." "How much with the buffer?" $340,000. I nodded. I picked up my cold tea. I said, "Give me 2 weeks to review the numbers properly, and then we'll talk about structure." He looked at me the way he used to look when I agreed to something he had expected to have to argue for longer, and he said, "Mom, I knew you'd get it." He meant it as a compliment. I took it as information. Because there is a difference between someone who gets it and someone who funds it, and that difference lives in the documentation, and I was already thinking about the documentation. I should tell you who I was before I tell you what I did with that folder. I am not a wealthy woman in the way that word usually implies. I did not inherit money or marry into it. I am a woman who spent 31 years as a senior accounts administrator for a mid-sized logistics firm, who lived carefully and saved deliberately and made every financial decision with the kind of attention that people who did not grow up with excess learn to apply to everything that matters. I own my home outright. I had a retirement fund that I had been building since I was 26. I had an investment account that was modest but consistent. $340,000 was not money I had sitting in one place doing nothing. It was money I had accumulated across 3 decades of choosing carefully, and deploying it meant making a considered decision about what I was willing to risk and what I needed to protect. I spent those 2 weeks doing exactly what I said I would. I reviewed the business plan line by line. I made notes in the margins. I researched equipment suppliers to cross-reference his quoted costs. I called a friend who had run a small medical practice for 15 years and asked her the questions Daniel's plan hadn't answered. Staff turnover in allied health, insurance billing cycles, the realistic timeline between opening and first profitability. Her answers adjusted my understanding of the revenue projections by approximately 18 months. I revised his numbers. I built my own model. Then I called a solicitor. Not because I distrusted Daniel, because I was deploying $340,000 and I had not accumulated that money by making undocumented decisions about it. The solicitor's name was Margaretchen, and she had been recommended to me by the same friend with the medical practice. And she was the kind of woman who asked the right uncomfortable questions in a tone that made you grateful someone was asking them. I told her what I was planning. She said, "What's the structure? Gift or investment?" I said, "Investment. I want a formal loan agreement with repayment terms, and I want a recorded security interest over the clinic's assets until the principal is recovered." Margaret nodded. She said, "An ownership?" I said, "The clinic is his. I'm not looking for equity. I'm looking for protection of the capital and a documented record of the terms under which it was provided." She drafted the agreement. It was 11 pages. It specified the loan amount, the interest rate, nominal, below market, deliberately generous, the repayment schedule beginning in month 24 of operations, the security interest registered against the clinic's equipment and fixtures, and a clause that required my written consent before any material change to the clinic's ownership or financial structure. I sent it to Daniel. He called me that evening. His voice had a texture I recognized. Not quite discomfort, not quite surprise, the specific register of someone who had expected something simpler. "Mom, this is very formal," he said. "It's $340,000, I said. "Formal is appropriate." There was a pause. Then he said, "Vanessa thinks it's a bit much. She said it makes it feel like you don't trust us." This was the first time Vanessa had appeared in a financial conversation that was between me and my son, and I noted it the way I note things, quietly, without comment, in the part of me that keeps records. "Vanessa is welcome to review it with her own solicitor if she'd like," I said pleasantly. "The terms are fair. The structure protects both of us." He signed it. 14 days later, I transferred the funds in 2 tranches, as specified in the agreement, and the clinic that would eventually have a name and floors I chose and walls that existed because of me began to take shape. Now let me ask, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your city below, because if you're still here, you already understand that this story is about what happens when a woman who spent 31 years paying attention to numbers finally turns that attention toward the people who assumed she was too soft to use it. The clinic opened 14 months after that kitchen table conversation. It was called Meridian Rehabilitation. Daniel's choice. I had no objection to it. And the opening was one of those evenings that holds a particular kind of emotional complexity that I don't think has a clean name. I was proud of him. Genuinely and completely proud. The way you are proud of something you watched grow from a folder of printed pages into a real thing with real patients and a sign on the door and staff who called your son Dr. Harwood. I stood in that clinic on opening night in a room full of his colleagues and their partners and a handful of early referring physicians, and I looked at the equipment I had funded and the floors I had chosen, and I felt the satisfaction of having put something real into the world through him, and I thought this was worth it. Vanessa was there, of course. She was always there. That was something I had understood from early in their relationship. That Vanessa occupied space with a thoroughness that left little room for anyone whose claim predated hers. She was beautiful and organized and socially precise, the kind of woman who knows exactly which version of warmth to deploy in which room. And on opening night, she deployed the version that was inclusive and gracious, and just warm enough to make any observation to the contrary seem ungracious. She introduced me to people as Daniel's mom, which is accurate, and also, in the way she said it, a category. Not a person with a name and a history and 11 pages of signed documentation in a filing cabinet. A category, a supporting role in a story she was already rewriting the authorship of. I smiled and shook hands and told people the clinic was going to do wonderful things, and I meant every word of it. I also went home that evening and took out my copy of the loan agreement and read through it one more time the way you check a lock before you go to sleep. Not because you expect the door to open, but because you have learned that the value of a lock lives in the habit of checking it. I filed it back in the cabinet. I made a note in my records of the opening date, the start of the clock on the 24-month period before repayments were due. And I made one other note, small, in the margin of my own private summary of the arrangement. It said, "Watch the structure." I did not know yet what I was watching for, but I had spent 31 years in accounts administration, and I knew the sound a structure makes when someone begins quietly moving things inside it. And something about that opening night, something about the way Vanessa's hand rested on the reception desk that I had paid for, with the particular ownership of a woman already practicing a gesture, told me that somewhere inside the architecture of what I had built for my son, something was already being rearranged. The first 18 months of the clinic's operation were, by every visible measure, a success. Patient numbers grew steadily. Referral relationships with 2 nearby GP practices were established by month 6. A third physiotherapist was hired at month 11 to manage the overflow. Daniel was working hard. I could see it in him when we had our monthly dinners, the particular tiredness of someone building something real, the kind of fatigue that sits differently in the body than ordinary exhaustion because it comes with a sense of forward motion. I was glad for it. I tracked the clinic's progress the way I tracked everything, carefully, from a respectful distance, through the information Daniel shared with me over those dinners, and through my own quiet attention to what was being shared and what was not. Because there is always a gap between what people tell you and what is actually happening. And after 31 years of reconciling accounts, I had developed a sensitivity to that gap the way a musician develops sensitivity to a note played slightly off pitch. The gap in those early months was small, barely audible. It sounded like Vanessa answering questions Daniel had previously answered himself. It sounded like topics changing when I asked about the business structure or the financial performance. It sounded like Daniel saying, "We're looking at some changes," without specifying what changes, and then moving on before I could ask. I noted it. I did not press. I had learned long ago that pressing people who are not ready to disclose something produces performance rather than information, and performance tells you less than silence. What I did instead was something I had always done and had never hidden from Daniel. I maintained my own records. From the beginning of the clinic's operation, I had kept a simple but thorough file. Monthly notes from our dinners, cross-referenced against the repayment schedule in the loan agreement. Correspondence, emails, messages, anything in writing that related to the clinic or the financial arrangement between us. Copies of every document I had signed. I did this not because I was building a case. I did it because I am a woman who spent 3 decades in accounts administration, and document management is simply how I exist in the world. It is my natural language. What I did not have, what I realized at the 14-month mark I should have requested earlier, was visibility into the clinic's actual financial statements. The loan agreement gave me the right to request them. I had not yet exercised that right because the monthly dinners had been warm and the progress reports had been positive, and I had been, I will be honest with you, deliberately choosing not to be the kind of mother-in-law who makes everything a transaction. I had wanted to lead with trust. This is the part of the story where I tell you that trust, extended without verification, is not a virtue. It is a gap in your documentation. At month 16, I sent Daniel a written request, email, so it was time-stamped and on record, asking for the clinic's most recent financial statements as permitted under our loan agreement. I kept the tone warm. I explained that with the repayment period beginning in 8 months, I wanted to understand the clinic's position in advance, so we could plan the schedule together if any adjustments were needed. I thought this was reasonable. I thought it communicated good faith. Daniel's response arrived 4 days later. It was warm in the way that responses drafted by someone else sometimes are, slightly more formal than his usual register, slightly more complete in its coverage of potential objections, the verbal equivalent of a letter that has been reviewed before sending. He said the statements were being prepared by their new accountant, and he would share them as soon as they were finalized. He said the clinic was in a strong position. He said Vanessa had been working closely with the accountant on a new financial structure that would make everything cleaner going forward. New accountant, new financial structure. I read those 4 words, and I set my phone down on the kitchen table, and I sat with them for a moment the way you sit with a sound that you're trying to locate. They had replaced the accountant I had been told about at the beginning. A man named Terry Okafor, who had been recommended by Margaret Chun and who had set up the initial bookkeeping systems. I had met Terry once, briefly, at the clinic's 6-month mark when I had stopped in to drop off some equipment documentation. He had seemed competent and straightforward. I had not been told Terry was leaving. I had not been told a new accountant was appointed. I had not been told there was a new financial structure being developed. I was the person whose $340,000 was the foundation of everything in that building, and I was learning about structural financial changes 4 days after requesting documents I was legally entitled to, in a warm email that had clearly been reviewed before sending. I called Margaret Chin the next morning. I did not present it as a crisis. I said, "Margaret, I want to understand what my options are if a borrower subject to our loan agreement makes changes to the business's financial structure without my written consent." Margaret was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "Walk me through what you know." I walked her through it. When I finished, she said, "The consent clause in your agreement is clear. Any material change to ownership or financial structure requires your written approval. If they're restructuring without notifying you, that's a potential breach." Potential. Until we see the documents, we don't know the scope of what they've done. Get the statements. Don't signal that you're concerned. Just request them under the agreement and give them a formal deadline. I sent a second email to Daniel that afternoon. This one was slightly different in tone, still warm, still respectful, but with the agreement's clause number cited and a 14-day deadline for document delivery. I signed it with my full name. Not Mom. My full name, the way you sign things when you need them to be understood as correspondence rather than conversation. I received a phone call from Vanessa 2 hours later. Not Daniel. Vanessa. Her voice had the specific texture of someone who has prepared for a conversation and is confident in their preparation. She said she understood I was asking about the financials, and she wanted to reassure me that everything was being handled professionally. She said the new structure was designed to protect the clinic's growth and that it would all be clear once the documents were ready. I said, "Vanessa, I appreciate the call. I'll expect the documents within 14 days as I've outlined." She said, "Of course." Then she said, "I do want to say, and I hope this comes across the way I mean it, that Daniel and I feel it would be healthier for everyone if the business relationship had a little more space from the family relationship going forward. We love you, but it can be complicated when those lines blur." I held the phone and looked out my kitchen window at the garden I had been tending for 20 years, and I thought about the word healthier and the word space and the particular way people use therapeutic language to dress up territorial behavior and make the person being pushed back feel like resistance is a form of dysfunction. I said, "I understand. The 14-day deadline stands." I hung up. Then I did something I had been meaning to do since month 14, but had delayed out of the same preference for trust over verification that I was now finished extending. I called a contact I had from my years in logistics, a woman named Frances who had spent 15 years as a corporate investigator before moving into compliance consulting, who owed me a professional favor from a situation I had helped her navigate 8 years earlier. I did not ask Frances to investigate my son's clinic. I asked her something much more specific. I asked her to run a search on the clinic's registered business details, ownership, directorship, any recent changes filed with the relevant business registry. Frances called me back in 40 minutes. She said, "When did your son get married?" I said, 3 years ago. Why? She said, because his wife was added as a co-director of the clinic's operating entity 11 weeks ago. And 6 weeks ago, the registered business address was changed to a legal firm I don't recognize. And 4 weeks ago, a new company was incorporated, different name, similar operational descriptor, registered to Vanessa Harwood as sole director. I wrote down every word. I wrote the dates in the margin. I wrote the name of the new company and the name of the legal firm and the date of Vanessa's directorship appointment, and I looked at what I had written and I understood, with the cold clarity of someone reading a balance sheet that doesn't reconcile, exactly what I was looking at. They were building a structure around the clinic that did not include me. Not around the loan, around the clinic itself. And the new company, the one registered to Vanessa alone, was not a complication. It was a destination. The question I could not yet answer, the one that kept me at my kitchen table until past midnight that evening, was whether Daniel was the architect of this or the passenger. And I needed to know the answer to that before I decided what to do next. Because what I did next was going to be irreversible, and I had not spent 31 years in accounts administration making irreversible moves without complete information. I did not sleep well that night, but I did not lie awake in distress either. I lay awake the way I used to lie awake before a difficult audit at work, alert, methodical, running through what I knew and what I needed to know and what the sequence of knowing it should be. There is a discipline to that kind of thinking that I had developed over decades, and it had never failed me professionally, and I was now applying it to the most personal financial exposure of my life, which is what $340,000 of your own carefully accumulated money becomes when someone begins quietly building a structure designed to separate you from it. What I knew was this. Vanessa had been added as co-director of the clinic's operating entity 11 weeks ago without my knowledge or written consent, which the loan agreement required for material changes to the business structure. 6 weeks ago, the registered address had changed to an unfamiliar legal firm, which suggested the restructuring was being managed by attorneys who had been specifically engaged for this purpose. 4 weeks ago, a new company had been incorporated in Vanessa's name alone, with a business descriptor similar enough to the clinic's operations to function as a parallel or successor entity. What I did not yet know was the relationship between the new company and the original clinic entity, whether any assets or patient relationships were being migrated between them, whether Daniel understood the full scope of what was being constructed around him, or whether he was being managed by Vanessa the same way I was being managed, with warmth and reassurance and carefully drafted emails. I needed to answer that last question before anything else because it determined everything. If Daniel was Vanessa's architect, if he had knowingly participated in a plan to restructure away from the loan agreement's protections, then I was dealing with one kind of situation. If Daniel was her passenger, present but not fully informed, being used as the legitimate face of a restructure designed primarily to benefit her, then I was dealing with another kind entirely, and the approach to each was completely different. I made a decision that night that I want to be precise about because it shaped everything that followed. I decided not to contact Daniel directly about what Francis had found. Not yet. I decided this for 2 reasons. The first was strategic. Contacting Daniel would signal that I had information, which would accelerate whatever timeline Vanessa was working to, and I needed more information before acceleration was in my interest. The second reason was harder to articulate and more important. If Daniel was a passenger, confronting him with what I knew before I had documented the full picture would put him in a position of having to choose between me and Vanessa without sufficient information to understand what he was choosing between. And I had learned from watching my own son for 29 years that Daniel made his worst decisions when he felt cornered. So I waited. I gathered. I documented. Margaret Shin received a detailed briefing the following morning, and she confirmed that the directorship addition and the new company incorporation were both potentially in breach of the consent clause, depending on their operational relationship to the original entity. She advised me to formally request the financial statements again, this time through her office directly, so that the request came on legal letterhead and established an unambiguous professional record. The request went out the same afternoon. Margaret gave them 21 days. While we waited, Frances continued her work. I want to tell you exactly what Frances did because this is not a story about luck or coincidence. It is a story about what becomes available to you when you know how to look and you have cultivated, over a long professional life, relationships with people who know how to look properly. Frances ran the new company's registration details. The incorporated entity was called Meridian Health Solutions, and it had been registered 41 days after my second email requesting financial statements, which meant it had been registered in direct temporal proximity to the moment I had signaled through the formality of citing the clause number that I was paying attention. Frances ran the legal firm whose address now appeared on the clinic's registry. It was a small commercial law practice with 4 partners specializing in business restructuring and asset protection. Asset protection. I wrote that down with the date. Frances also ran a search on the clinic's equipment, specifically the security interest I had registered over it as part of the loan agreement. The registered charge that meant the equipment was formally encumbered to me as the loan security. The charge was still registered. Nothing had been moved against it yet, but Frances flagged something that made my hand go still over my notepad. 3 pieces of equipment, the most valuable 3, collectively representing approximately 40% of the secured asset value, had been listed in a recent insurance policy renewal under Meridian Health Solutions rather than the original clinic entity. Not transferred, not formally reassigned, just listed under the new company's name in an insurance document, the kind of administrative detail that in isolation looks like a clerical error and in context looks like the first stage of an asset migration. I called Margaret immediately. She said, "That's not a clerical error." I said, "I know." She said, "We need to move, not aggressively, carefully. But we need to establish formally that you are aware of the insurance reclassification and that you consider it a potential encumbrance on your secured interest." We sent a letter that afternoon. Legal letterhead, Margaret's signature, referencing the specific pieces of equipment by their serial numbers, which I had recorded in my original documentation when I had personally overseen the equipment delivery and installation 18 months earlier, because I am a woman who records serial numbers, because that is who I am, and formally notifying both the original clinic entity and Meridian Health Solutions that any reclassification of assets subject to the registered security interest required my written consent, and that any unauthorized movement of those assets would constitute a breach of the loan agreement with immediate legal consequences. The letter was delivered by registered mail and by email with read receipts to both entities and to the legal firm whose address appeared on the registry. 3 read receipts confirmed within 4 hours. Nothing came back in return. The silence was loud. Now, if you've been with me from the beginning of this story, and I think you have, because the kind of person who is still here is the kind of person who understands that the most important battles are fought in filing cabinets and on legal letterhead rather than in shouting matches, then you know that what I'm describing is not revenge. Not yet. What I'm describing is the preparation stage. The part where you establish every formal position before the person who underestimated you realizes that you have been doing so. Because once they realize, the game changes. And I was not ready for the game to change yet. If this story is landing for you, if you recognize the particular exhaustion of being the person who funded everything and is being managed out of it, subscribe right now, because what happens in the next stage involves a document that Vanessa did not know existed and a conversation that Daniel did not know had been recorded. And those 2 things together are what turn a defensive position into something else entirely. The 21-day deadline for the financial statements passed. Nothing arrived. Margaret sent a formal notice of breach of the loan agreement's disclosure obligations, citing the specific clause and specifying that failure to produce the documents within a further 7 days would result in us exploring our legal remedies, including the potential calling of the loan. The loan, $340,000, plus accrued interest, callable on breach. I want you to understand what calling the loan meant in practical terms, because this is the mechanism, and the mechanism matters. If I called the loan, if I formally declared the agreement in breach and demanded repayment, Daniel and Vanessa would need to find $340,000 plus interest in a time frame specified by the agreement. They did not have that money. The clinic's growth had been real, but it had not generated that level of liquid capital in 18 months. They would need to either negotiate a resolution with me, refinance through a commercial lender, or face the enforcement of my security interest over the clinic's equipment, which meant I could, through the proper legal process, reclaim the assets against which my loan was secured. This is what $340,000 of properly documented lending looks like when someone tries to restructure around it without the lender's knowledge. It does not look like a mother being replaced. It looks like a creditor with a registered security interest and a breach notice, and an attorney who went to the same law school as the judge who handles commercial disputes in this jurisdiction. The 7 days passed. On the morning of day 8, Daniel called me. Not Vanessa. Daniel. His voice had lost the managed quality of the recent emails and phone calls. He sounded like himself, the actual self, the one I had raised, the one who used to sit at my kitchen table with folders of printed pages and a look between a dream and a demand. He sounded tired. He sounded, underneath the tiredness, something that I recognized as the specific register of a person who has recently discovered they did not have complete information about a situation they thought they understood. He said, "Mom, I think we need to talk." I said, "I've been available to talk for some time, Daniel." He said, I know that. Can I come over?" I said yes. He came that evening. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table, the 11-page agreement table, the folder of printed pages table, and he looked at his hands for a long moment before he spoke. He said, "I didn't know about the new company." I looked at my son. I looked at him carefully, the way you look at someone when the answer to a question you've been sitting with for weeks is finally in the room, and I looked for the seams in what he was telling me the way I had learned to look for seams in everything. I did not find them. What I found instead was something that looked genuine and looked ashamed and looked like a man who had allowed someone else to manage something critical because it had been easier than paying attention, and who was now sitting with the cost of that. "Tell me what you do know," I said. He talked for 40 minutes. What he told me filled in several of the gaps in my understanding and confirmed several of the conclusions Francis and I had reached independently. And it also gave me something I had not had before, his account, in his own words, time-stamped in my memory, of the sequence of decisions that had led to this table on this evening. Vanessa had driven the restructuring, he said. She had told him it was about tax efficiency and liability protection. She had told him the new company was a standard holding structure. She had told him the account change was about cost. She had managed the legal engagement and the correspondence and the registry filings, and she had told him, when my letters arrived through Margaret, that she was handling it and that I was being difficult and that it would all be resolved once the new structure was in place and the old agreement was superseded. Superseded. He said that word, and then he stopped, because I think he heard it land differently in the open air of my kitchen than it had sounded in whatever conversation Vanessa had used it in. "She told you the agreement could be superseded," I said. "Yes. Without my consent." He looked at his hands again. "I think I let myself believe what was easier to believe," he said. There are moments in a long relationship between a parent and a child where something real passes between you that is not accusation and not forgiveness, but something in the space between them, a mutual recognition of how things actually are without performance on either side. This was one of those moments. I let it exist. Then I opened the file I had placed on the table before he arrived. The documentation file. 47 pages of everything Francis and I had assembled, tabbed and dated and annotated in the margins in my own handwriting. I placed it in front of him and I said, "Read from the beginning." He read for 20 minutes in silence. When he finished, he looked up. He did not look like the golden child. He looked like a man who had just read 47 pages of what it looks like when someone you trusted decides that the person who built the foundation is replaceable. "What do I need to do?" he said. I had been thinking about the answer to that question for 3 weeks. "Nothing yet," I said. "I need you to understand something first. Vanessa does not know the extent of what I have documented. She does not know about Francis. She does not know that I have a meeting scheduled with a commercial litigation attorney next Thursday. She does not know that I recorded a conversation with her 6 weeks ago in which she made a representation about the loan agreement that directly contradicts the terms of the signed document." Daniel went still. "You recorded her?" "I record conversations in which financial matters relating to a legal agreement are discussed," I said. "I have done this since the agreement was signed. It is legal in this jurisdiction with the consent of one party, and I am one party." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What was on the recording?" I looked at my son across the kitchen table that had held the dream and the folder and the 11 pages. And I said, "Enough." What I had not yet told him, what I needed to sit with for a little longer before I disclosed it, was what else Vanessa had said on that recording. Because the conversation I had captured 6 weeks ago, in a phone call I had anticipated would be substantive and had therefore prepared for, contained something that went beyond a misrepresentation about the loan agreement. It contained something that, in the context of everything Francis had found and everything Margaret had now formally documented, changed the nature of what Vanessa had been building from a restructuring story into something with a different and considerably more serious name. I want to tell you about the recording because the recording is the axis on which everything else turns, and I want to be precise about how it came to exist, because precision is what separates a useful document from an inadmissible one, and I had been careful in ways that mattered. 6 weeks before Daniel sat at my kitchen table reading 47 pages of his wife's architecture, Vanessa had called me. This was not the first call she had made to manage my concerns. It was the third. And by the third call, I had developed a clear enough understanding of her pattern to know what the call would contain before she made it. Her pattern was this. She would open with warmth, move quickly to reassurance, introduce a reframe of whatever concern I had raised that subtly repositioned my concern as a misunderstanding or an overreaction, and then close with something that sounded like inclusion, but functioned as instruction. It was a competent pattern. It worked on people who were not paying attention to the structure of what was being said underneath the tone of how it was being delivered. I had been paying attention since the first call. For the third call, I was prepared in a specific way. I had checked the laws in my jurisdiction regarding single-party consent to recording, meaning the law that governs whether a person can record a conversation they are participating in without notifying the other party. In my jurisdiction, the answer is yes. One-party consent means that if you are part of the conversation, you may record it. I had a small digital recorder that I had purchased years ago for professional use, the kind that sits on a desk and picks up both sides of a phone call clearly when the phone is on speaker. I placed it on my kitchen table. I put the call on speaker. I pressed record. And then I answered in exactly the voice I always used with Vanessa. Pleasant, measured, giving nothing away. The call lasted 23 minutes. The first 12 minutes followed her pattern precisely. Warmth, reassurance, reframe. She told me the restructuring was routine. She told me the new company was a protective measure for Daniel's professional liability. She told me that the equipment reclassification in the insurance documents was an administrative decision made by their broker and had no bearing on my security interest. She said all of this smoothly and confidently in the voice of a woman who had either convinced herself it was true or had decided the distinction did not matter. Then I asked her a question I had prepared specifically because I knew it would take her off the script she had prepared. I said, Vanessa, I want to ask you directly, does the new company structure affect the repayment obligations under the loan agreement? There was a pause. Brief, 2, maybe 3 seconds, but on a recording, a pause is a timestamp. It is evidence of a moment of calculation. Then she said the loan agreement was structured around the original entity. As the entity evolves, the agreement evolves with it. That's just how business structures work. I said, to be clear, are you telling me that as the entity changes, the original loan agreement's terms change too? She said, I'm saying the agreement needs to be looked at in the context of the new structure. The old terms may not be directly applicable in the same way going forward. I said, pleasantly, and the repayment schedule? She said, that's something we'll address once the new structure is fully established. There may need to be a renegotiation. Renegotiation. The word landed on my kitchen table like something dropped from a height. Because the loan agreement, the 11-page document that Margaret Chen had drafted, that Daniel had signed, that had been executed and witnessed and filed, did not contain a renegotiation mechanism triggered by the borrower's decision to restructure their entity. It contained a consent requirement, my consent, which had never been sought and never been given. What Vanessa had just told me on a recorded call was that she intended to use the restructuring she had built without my knowledge or consent as the basis for renegotiating the terms of a legally binding agreement that she did not have the authority to renegotiate unilaterally. In a single 2-minute exchange, she had moved from misrepresentation to something that a commercial litigation attorney would look at and use the word fraudulent to describe. I said, thank you for clarifying that, Vanessa. I'll be in touch through Margaret's office. She said, fine, of course, and closed the call with the warmth she always closed calls with. And I reached across my kitchen table and I pressed stop on the recorder and I sat in my quiet house for a long time. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that because I think there is an assumption that moments like this feel like winning, and they do not at first. What they feel like is the particular heaviness of a confirmed understanding. The gap between what you suspected and what you now knew had closed, and the closing of it meant that the thing you had hoped was not happening was in fact happening. And that knowledge has a weight to it regardless of what tools it puts in your hands. I called Margaret the next morning. I played her the relevant portion of the recording. She was quiet for a moment after it ended, and then she said, "This is significant." I said, "Tell me how significant." She said, "What she's described, using the restructuring to alter the repayment obligations of a signed loan agreement without the lender's consent, that's not a misunderstanding of the agreement's terms. That's an attempt to use a corporate restructure to defeat a creditor's rights. In a commercial context, depending on the intent, that can constitute fraudulent conveyance." Fraudulent conveyance. The legal term for when assets or obligations are restructured specifically to avoid satisfying a legitimate creditor's claim. It is the kind of finding that moves a dispute from the civil column into a column with different and considerably more serious implications. Margaret said she needed to review the full recording and the complete documentation Francis had assembled before she could advise on next steps. She also said she wanted to engage a forensic accountant to review whatever financial statements we eventually received. Because we would receive them now, she was confident of that, because the breach notice had teeth and Vanessa's attorneys would know it. The financial statements arrived on day 6 of the 7-day cure period. Not warmly, not with an explanatory email from Daniel. They arrived via the legal firm, formally, in a package addressed to Margaret's office, with a cover letter that described the documents as being provided without prejudice and without admission of any breach of the loan agreement. Margaret forwarded them to me and to the forensic accountant she had engaged, a man named Robert Stein, who had spent 20 years as an auditor before moving into litigation support, and who had the specific professional gift of being able to look at a set of financial statements and identify not just what they said, but what they had been arranged to say. Robert called me 4 days after receiving the documents. He said, "How much time do you have?" I said, "As much as you need." He talked for an hour and 20 minutes. I took notes on 6 pages of my legal pad, dates and figures in the margins the way I always wrote. And by the time he finished, I had a picture that was considerably more complete and considerably more damaging than anything I had assembled independently. The clinic's operating entity, the original one, the one into which my $340,000 had flowed and whose assets were subject to my security interest, had been systematically devalued over the preceding 8 months. Not through poor performance. The clinic itself was performing well. Patient volumes were up. Revenue was up. But through a series of intercompany transactions between the original entity and Meridian Health Solutions, the new company registered to Vanessa. Income had been redirected. Expenses had been loaded onto the original entity, and the net financial position of the original entity had been deliberately suppressed to make it appear less viable than it actually was. Robert used the word deliberately with the precision of a man who does not use that word unless he can support it in a formal report. The effect of the manipulation was this. The original entity, against whose assets my loan was secured, looked on paper like a marginally profitable business struggling under overhead. Meridian Health Solutions, by contrast, had been receiving the redirected income and had clean financials and no registered encumbrances. If the restructuring had proceeded as Vanessa had planned, if I had accepted the renegotiation conversation, if I had not engaged Margaret and Francis, if I had been, as she had assumed I would be, too emotionally invested in my relationship with Daniel to pursue this with professional rigor, the original entity would eventually have been wound down or allowed to fail. My security interest would have been worth considerably less than the equipment's actual value by that point due to depreciation and selective asset migration. And Meridian Health Solutions would have continued operating, carrying the clinic's patient base and goodwill and revenue forward, unencumbered, under Vanessa's sole directorship. She had been building an exit from my loan. A clean one, the kind that leaves the lender holding a depleted security interest and a borrower entity with nothing worth pursuing and a new company across the street that somehow has everything the old one used to have. Robert filed his preliminary findings with Margaret in a formal report, 28 pages with appendices. He flagged 3 specific transactions that in his professional opinion warranted further investigation and potentially regulatory review, depending on the jurisdiction's treatment of intercompany fund flows between related entities. Margaret read the report and called me and said 2 things. The first was that we now had enough to move from a civil breach and recovery position to something broader if we chose to. The second was a question. She said, "Before we decide how to proceed, how do you want this to end?" I thought about that question for a long time before I answered it. Not because I did not know what outcome I wanted in practical terms. I knew exactly what I wanted, and I had known since the morning Francis called me with the search results. I was thinking about Daniel, about the kitchen table conversation, and the 47 pages, and the look on his face when he read them, and the way he had said, "I didn't know about the new company," in a voice that I had listened to and found no seams in. About whether the end I was moving toward was one that left room for a son and a mother to exist on the other side of it, or whether the weight of what had been done was going to make that impossible regardless. I said, I want full recovery of the loan principal and accrued interest. I want the intercompany transactions reviewed by the appropriate authorities. And I want it to happen in a setting where there is no possibility of it being quietly resolved and no possibility of the record being rearranged after the fact. Margaret said, that last part, what do you mean by setting? I said, Vanessa made her declaration about my replaceability in the clinic's reception area. In front of the reception staff, in front of a patient who was checking in front of my son who said nothing. She said it in public because she believed public was safe for her. She believed that being in her space, in the clinic I had funded, made her untouchable. I paused. I want the resolution to happen in a setting that is equally public and considerably less comfortable for her than a reception desk she thinks she owns. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know exactly the setting. She told me about the clinic's upcoming lease renewal. The commercial lease on the property, which I had not known about until Margaret, in the course of reviewing the legal firm's correspondence, had noticed a reference to a lease renewal meeting scheduled with the building's property management company for the following month. A meeting that would include the original entity's directors, the property management representatives, and because the lease renewal involved a significant increase in the annual rental and therefore constituted a material financial commitment, the entity's primary secured creditor would have standing to request inclusion as an interested party. The primary secured creditor was me. Margaret filed the standing request the next morning. It was approved 4 days later. I was formally notified that I would be included in the lease renewal meeting as a creditor with registered security interest over the entity's assets. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the property management company's offices, a neutral space, a professional space, a space where everything said would be in front of witnesses who were neither family nor employees, and where the record would be kept by people who had no interest in what that record contained beyond accuracy. Vanessa's attorney called Margaret the same afternoon the notification was issued. He said his client was objecting to my inclusion in the lease meeting on the grounds that the creditor's standing had not been established in relation to the specific lease renewal process. Margaret sent back a 2-paragraph response citing the relevant commercial law provisions governing secured creditors' rights in material financial commitments by debtor entities, with footnoted statute references. In a tone so professionally measured, it was almost its own kind of warning. The objection was withdrawn within 24 hours. The night before the meeting, Daniel called me. He said he needed to tell me something before tomorrow. He said he had found something on the clinic's shared administrative drive, in a folder he had not previously had reason to open, labeled with an accountant's reference number that turned out to contain something that was not routine accountancy. He said he had looked at it and he did not fully understand what he was looking at, but he thought I should see it before the meeting. He sent it to me by email at 9:47 that evening. I opened it at my kitchen table with my legal pad beside me, and I read it once, and then I read it again, and then I put my pen down because what Daniel had found was not a financial document. It was a communication, an email chain between Vanessa and the new accountant, the one she had appointed without my knowledge, that predated the new company's incorporation by 3 weeks, and that contained, in its third message, a sentence that I will not quote in full, but that contained the words, before the creditor realizes. In a context that removed every remaining ambiguity about whether the restructuring had been accidental or incidental, or the result of legitimate business planning. It had been designed, from the beginning, with my loan's existence as the specific problem it was designed to solve. I forwarded the chain to Margaret at 10:03 that evening with 4 words in the subject line. Bring everything tomorrow. Morning. The property management company's offices were on the 14th floor of a glass building in the commercial district, the kind of offices that exist in a register of professional neutrality, gray carpet, conference table long enough for 8, a window that looked out over the city with the indifference of a view that has witnessed many difficult conversations and retained none of them. I arrived 12 minutes early. Margaret was already there, which is what Margaret always was. Already there, already arranged, a woman whose preparation was so thorough it manifested as a kind of stillness. She had a leather folder on the table in front of her and a second folder beside it that I recognized as the documentation package, tabbed and ordered, the architecture of 3 months of careful work made physical. I sat down beside her. I placed my bag on the floor. I put my hands flat on the table for a moment, the way I do when I need to feel something solid, and then I folded them in my lap. And I looked at the window and the indifferent view, and I breathed. Margaret said quietly, without looking up from her folder, "Robert's report is tabbed at section 3. The email chain Daniel sent is printed and at section 7. The recording transcript is at section 5 with the audio file on the device clipped inside the back cover." I said, "And the breach notice timeline?" "Section 2, she said. "Chronological, dated, complete." I nodded. We did not say anything else. The property management representatives arrived at 8:58, 2 of them, a man named Stephen, who was the lease manager, and a woman named Andrea, who was their legal counsel, both of whom had been briefed that the meeting involved a creditor with standing, and both of whom had the careful neutrality of professionals who understand they are about to be in a room where something is going to happen and whose job is to document it accurately rather than have feelings about it. They sat across from us. They arranged their own papers. At 9:02, Vanessa arrived. She came in with her attorney, a man I had not met but whose firm Margaret had researched thoroughly, and she came in the way she came into all rooms, with the occupying energy, the social sureness, the warm professional smile that she deployed like a tool she had never had reason to doubt the effectiveness of. She saw me at 9:03, which was 1 second after she cleared the doorway and 2 seconds before she had completed her entry into the room. I watched the smile hold for exactly 1 beat longer than it would have if she had been genuinely unaffected, and then it recalibrated into something more controlled and more careful. And she took her seat across the table and placed her folder in front of her and looked at her attorney briefly in the way people look at their attorneys when they need a half second of grounding. Daniel arrived at 9:05. He sat down beside Vanessa, but not close to her in the way married people usually orient toward each other in professional settings. There was a gap between them that was not large in physical terms, but that had the quality of a considered distance, the kind that exists when 2 people have had a conversation that has not been resolved. He did not look at me when he sat down. Then he did. He looked at me for 1 second with an expression that I read as a combination of exhaustion and resolve, and I gave him a small nod, and he looked back at the table. Stephen opened the meeting with the formal agenda: lease renewal terms, proposed rental increase, 5-year extension discussion, creditor standing notation. Standard framing: the kind of procedural opening that establishes the official record of what the meeting was called for before what the meeting is actually about becomes visible. Vanessa's attorney spoke first on the substantive matters. He presented a position on the lease renewal that was confident and well-prepared, arguing for a modified rental structure tied to the new company Meridian Health Solutions as the proposed lease successor entity, on the grounds that the operational transition from the original clinic entity to the new structure was substantially complete. Substantially complete. He said it with the assurance of a man who had been told that the person on the other side of the table was a retired accounts administrator who would be represented by a property lawyer handling a creditor notation, and who would not have the depth of documentation to challenge a well-constructed corporate transition argument. Margaret let him finish. She was good at letting people finish. It was one of the things I appreciated most about her. The patience, the complete absence of the reactive interruption that signals to the room that you are rattled. She let every word of his presentation land and settle, And then she opened her folder to section 2 and she said, in a tone of absolute professional calm, before we address the lease succession question, I'd like to establish the creditor's position on the underlying entity's financial obligations, as these are directly material to any proposed succession arrangement. She walked through the breach notice timeline, 12 minutes, section by section, dated and documented. The sequence of events from my first financial statement request through the formal notices, through the unresponsive periods, through the eventual document delivery. Stephen and Andrea from property management were taking notes. Vanessa's attorney was maintaining his composure, but his pen had stopped moving at approximately the 4-minute mark, which is when Margaret reached the section covering the registered directorship changes and the new company incorporation and their temporal relationship to my formal document requests. Then Margaret opened to section 3, Robert Stein's forensic accounting report. She did not read it in full. She summarized it in 7 minutes with the precision of someone who has spent enough time with the document to know exactly which sentences carry the most weight in a room. She read those sentences: the intercompany transaction analysis, the income redirection, the deliberate suppression of the original entity's net position. The word Robert had used, deliberately, landed in the conference room the way it had landed in my kitchen when he had said it to me on the phone, with the specific gravity of a professionally credentialed person attaching that word to a documented pattern of financial behavior. Vanessa's attorney said, these are preliminary findings from a privately commissioned report and have not been subject to, Margaret said, section 4, and slid a copy of Robert's full credentials and the methodology appendix across the table without raising her voice. He stopped. Then Margaret opened to section 5, the recording transcript. She placed a printed copy in front of every person at the table, including Stephen and Andrea from property management, who accepted their copies with the careful neutrality of people who understand they are now part of a formal record. She said, on the date noted at the top of this transcript, my client participated in a phone conversation with Vanessa Harwood, in which Mrs. Harwood made representations about the loan agreement's applicability to the restructured entity. I will play the relevant portion of the audio recording now. She pressed play on the device clipped inside the back cover of her folder. The recording was clear. Kitchens are acoustically simple spaces, and my recorder was a good one, and Vanessa's voice was as confident and smooth on the recording as it was in every room she occupied. The room listened to 12 minutes of Vanessa explaining that the loan agreement's terms would need to be renegotiated in light of the restructuring she had built without my consent. The room listened to her say the words, the old terms may not be directly applicable in the same way going forward, in the voice of a woman who had believed she was managing a soft target. The room listened to this in the specific silence of people who are hearing something they cannot unhear and are processing its implications in real time. When the recording ended, Margaret pressed stop. She did not comment on it. She did not need to. She opened to section 7. She placed a printed copy of the email chain Daniel had found in front of each person at the table. She let them read it. Vanessa read it. I watched her read it. I watched her eyes move down the page, and I watched her reach the third message, and I watched her go very still in the way that people go still when they encounter in documentary form the evidence of something they believed was private. Her attorney leaned over and read it beside her, and then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly with the expression of a man recalculating. Vanessa looked up from the email chain, and she looked across the table for the first time since the recording had played, and she looked at me. Not with the warmth, not with the professional smile, or the managing tone, or the occupying energy. She looked at me with the expression of a person who has just understood that the room they believe they controlled has been structured by someone else entirely, and that the someone else is the woman they told was replaceable. I looked back at her with the same expression I had held in the Meridian's private dining room. The same expression I had held across Gerald's desk, the same expression I carried into every room where someone had decided I was furniture, steady, present, giving nothing away, having already given everything necessary. Then she did the thing that people do when arrogance has no remaining architecture to stand on. She looked at her attorney and she said, with a fracture in the managing tone that she could not entirely close, "We should take a recess." Her attorney said, "I agree." Stephen from property management said that a short recess was fine and that the meeting would resume in 15 minutes. Margaret closed her folder. She did not look at me, but she reached over and placed her hand briefly on mine on the table. A single quiet gesture that contained more acknowledgement than most speeches, and then she withdrew it and poured herself a glass of water from the carafe in the center of the table. During the recess, Daniel walked to the window and stood with his back to the room, looking out at the city, and I went and stood beside him. We did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, quietly enough that only I could hear it, "I'm sorry, Mom." I said, "I know." He said, "What happens now?" I said, "Now the system does what it's built to do when someone tries to defeat it with paperwork that isn't as clean as they thought it was." He nodded. He kept looking at the window. Then he said something I had not expected, something that shifted the weight of the morning in a way that I needed time to sit with properly. He said, "She told me you wouldn't fight for it. She told me you loved me too much to make it difficult." I stood beside my son at that window for a moment with that sentence in the air between us. Then I said, "I do love you that much." That's exactly why I documented everything. If you followed this from the beginning, you already know that what happened when that recess ended was not a negotiation. It was a reckoning. And if you want to see every consequence land in real time, subscribe now, because the aftermath is the part that nobody in that room had prepared for except me. The recess lasted 26 minutes. Not 15, as Stephen had suggested, but 26, because Vanessa's attorney needed the additional 11 minutes to complete a conversation with his client that I can only reconstruct from its results, which were visible the moment they walked back into that conference room. Vanessa came back indifferently than she had left. The occupying energy was gone, not replaced by anything dramatic, no visible distress, no red eyes, nothing that the property management representatives would later describe as a breakdown, just an absence. The way a room feels different when something that was generating heat has been switched off. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. Her attorney sat beside her and opened a fresh legal pad and wrote a date at the top and underlined it, which is what attorneys do when they are shifting from advocacy mode into damage containment mode and need the visual anchor of a clean page. Margaret opened her folder again. She did not look up when they came in. She was already on the page she needed to be on, which was the section containing the formal recovery demand, the document she had prepared based on Robert Stein's findings and the loan agreement's breach provisions and the recording and the email chain, the document that specified precisely what resolution my position required and what the consequences of not reaching that resolution would be. She placed a copy in front of Vanessa's attorney. He read the first page. Then he read the second. Then he set it down and said, "My client would like to propose a resolution framework." Margaret said, "We're prepared to hear a proposal." What followed was 90 minutes of the most focused professional negotiation I have ever witnessed, and I have worked alongside contract negotiations for 30 years in logistics, so I have a reference point. Margaret was extraordinary. She did not raise her voice once. She did not show impatience or triumph or any of the emotions that would have given the other side a temperature to read and respond to. She was simply relentlessly, technically precise, citing clause numbers and report page references and recording timestamps with the fluency of someone who had lived inside this documentation for months and knew every corner of it. Vanessa's attorney made 3 proposals. The first was a restructured repayment plan spread over 7 years with a reduced principal reflecting what he described as the original entity's diminished asset position. Margaret cited Robert Stein's finding that the asset position had been deliberately suppressed through intercompany transactions and noted that any repayment calculation based on the suppressed figures would not reflect the actual recoverable value and would not be acceptable. The second proposal was a negotiated settlement involving Meridian Health Solutions, assuming the loan obligation in exchange for the security interest being transferred to the new entity. Margaret noted that assuming the loan obligation through the new entity without addressing the fraudulent conveyance finding would not resolve the regulatory exposure that the email chain and the intercompany transaction analysis had created, and that a settlement which addressed only the civil component while leaving the regulatory question open was not in my interest to accept. The third proposal was full repayment of the loan principal and accrued interest within 90 days, funded through a refinancing of the clinic's property lease and equipment, in exchange for Margaret's client agreeing not to make a formal referral to the relevant regulatory body regarding the intercompany transactions. Margaret looked at me. I looked at the table for a moment. Then I said, full principal, full accrued interest, and the documentation of the intercompany transactions is referred to the appropriate body regardless. My agreement not to pursue further civil action beyond the loan recovery is the consideration I am offering in exchange for the 90-day settlement timeline. The regulatory question is not mine to trade away. Vanessa's attorney wrote something on his legal pad. He conferred with Vanessa in a voice low enough that only she could hear it. She said something back. He wrote something else. Then he said, "My client accepts the principal and interest recovery on the 90-day timeline. She cannot agree to the regulatory referral." Margaret said, "My client is not requiring your client's agreement. She is informing you that the referral will be made as a matter of documentation integrity, independent of the settlement. The settlement covers the civil component. The regulatory referral is a separate matter that my client considers an obligation of accuracy, not a negotiating position." There was a silence. Then Vanessa's attorney said, "I understand." He said it in the tone of a man who had just finished mapping the full scope of a situation and found no exits he had not already tried. Stephen from property management, who had been sitting with the careful neutrality of someone who has witnessed more than he expected to at a lease renewal meeting, cleared his throat and said that given the matters discussed, the property management company would need to defer the lease succession question pending resolution of the civil and regulatory matters, and that the existing lease with the original entity would remain in effect during that period. This was, in practical terms, a significant outcome, because if the lease succession to Meridian Health Solutions was deferred, if Vanessa could not transfer the clinic's operating location to her new company while the civil settlement and regulatory referral were active, then the new company's operational viability was substantially compromised. A rehabilitation clinic without a location is a letterhead and a registration number and nothing else. The meeting concluded at 11:47. I remember the time because I looked at my watch when Stephen called it closed, and I noted it the way I note things, with the automatic precision of someone for whom documentation is not a choice, but a condition of engagement with the world. We rode the elevator down in silence, Margaret and I, and walked through the glass building's lobby and out onto the street where the morning had become fully itself, bright and cold and indifferent to everything that had happened on the 14th floor. Margaret said, 90 days. Robert will monitor the refinancing process. I said, I know. She said, you did well in there. I said, I did what I prepared to do. She smiled at that, a small, real smile, the kind that does not perform itself. Then she said, what about Daniel? I said, that's a longer conversation. She nodded. She understood that some resolutions are clean and some are not, and that the ones involving your children are never entirely in either category. We parted on the pavement and I walked to my car and I sat in it for 10 minutes before I drove anywhere, because 10 minutes of stillness after 90 minutes of that room was what I needed, and I had learned to give myself what I needed without requiring permission. The regulatory referral was filed by Margaret's office 12 days after the meeting. It went to the relevant Financial Conduct Authority with Robert Stein's full report, the email chain, the intercompany transaction analysis, and a formal cover letter from Margaret documenting the sequence of events with the precision that had characterized every document in this case. I will not tell you the full outcome of that referral because regulatory processes are slow and confidential and still active as I am telling you this story. What I can tell you is that Meridian Health Solutions was placed under a compliance review within 30 days of the referral. That the new accountant Vanessa had appointed resigned from the engagement within 3 weeks of the referral being filed, which is what accountants do when a regulatory review begins and they need to manage their own professional exposure. And that the legal firm whose address had appeared on the clinic's registry withdrew from the engagement shortly after, citing a conflict of interest that they declined to specify, but that Margaret found entirely predictable given the content of the referral. The loan was repaid in full on day 87 of the 90-day settlement window, not by Vanessa, by the refinancing arrangement as agreed, which was executed through a commercial lender who assessed the clinic's actual asset value, Robert's valuation, the accurate one, not the suppressed figures, and provided the facility on terms that reflected what the clinic was actually worth, $340,000, and the accrued interest transferred to my account on a Wednesday morning. I was at my kitchen table when the notification came through on my banking app. I looked at it for a long time, not with triumph, not with the particular warmth of a score being settled. With something quieter than that, the specific satisfaction of a circle closing, of a thing that had been documented and pursued with rigor, arriving at the outcome that the documentation and the rigor had made possible. I made a cup of tea, a good one, properly steeped in the cup I like. I sat at my kitchen table and I drank it while it was still hot, and I looked at my garden through the window, and I let the morning be ordinary. Meridian Health Solutions never became operational in any meaningful sense. With the lease succession deferred and the compliance review active and the accountant and the legal firm both withdrawn, the structure Vanessa had spent months building quietly collapsed under the weight of its own exposure. The original clinic entity, the one with Daniel's name on it, the one that had grown from a folder of printed pages and a kitchen table conversation and $340,000 of my carefully accumulated life, was still operating, still seeing patients, still running the referral relationships with the GP practices that Daniel had built in those first 18 months when he had been tired in the good way, the forward motion way. Daniel and Vanessa separated 4 months after the meeting. I did not cause this. I want to be precise about that because it matters to me that it is understood correctly. I did not pursue the legal and financial resolution I pursued in order to end my son's marriage. I pursued it because $340,000 of my documented, secured, legally protected money was being structured away from me with deliberate intent, and because I had spent 31 years in accounts administration learning that the only response to a deliberate misrepresentation of numbers is an accurate one. The marriage ended because of what Vanessa had built and what Daniel had allowed himself not to see, and what the email chain had made undeniable when he read it in his own kitchen on the night. He called me and said he needed to tell me something. Some structures collapsed because they were always built on the wrong foundations. I did not build that foundation. I only documented it. Daniel called me 6 weeks after the separation to tell me. He was at his clinic. I could hear the particular quality of the space in the background, the slight echo of the reception area, the equipment I had funded and tracked by serial number and maintained my security interest over while someone tried to reclassify it in an insurance document as belonging to a company that had not yet been disclosed to me. He said, "I want to start over." Not with the business, I mean with us. With you and me. I said, I'd like that too. He said, I need you to know that I understand what I let happen. I understood it when I read those 47 pages, and I've understood it more every day since. I said, I know you do. He said, are we okay? I thought about the kitchen table and the folder and the look between a dream and a demand, and the cold tea and the 11 pages and the serial numbers and the Thursday nights at my desk and the recording and the morning in the glass building and the cup of tea I had made when the repayment notification came through. I said, we're getting there. That was honest. It was not everything, and it was not nothing, and it was where we actually were, and I have always preferred the accurate figure to the comfortable one. I still have the loan agreement, the 11-page document, Margaret's drafting, Daniel's signature, witnessed and filed. It lives in my cabinet alongside the 47 pages and Robert Stein's report and the recording device and the printed email chain and every tab and annotation and margin note from 3 months of careful work. I will probably never need any of it again. But I keep it the way I keep everything that costs me something real, not as a monument to the difficulty of it, but as evidence that I was here, that I paid attention, that when someone decided the person who built the foundation was replaceable, I had already made sure the foundation had my name in it. I am 58 years old. I have my home and my garden and my retirement account and $340,000 returned to the place it came from. I have a son I am slowly rebuilding something with, honestly and without pretense, on terms that are clear to both of us. I have Margaret Chen's number saved under M in my phone, and a digital recorder that I charged last week out of habit, and a legal pad with a fresh page ready on my kitchen table. And I have a question I keep coming back to, the one I want to leave with you because I think about it often and I do not have a clean answer for it, and I suspect you might. When someone tells you that you are replaceable, when they say it in the space you built, in the voice of someone who has already decided your softness is a weakness, and your love is a liability, and your careful accumulated life is a resource to be restructured around, what is the most important thing you choose to do next? I chose documentation. I chose Margaret and Francis and Robert and a recorder on a kitchen table and a legal pad with dates in the margins. I chose to be precisely, immovably, undeniably the person whose name was in the foundation. What would you have chosen?